She had lived invisible for 24 years, her heart locked away behind silence and shame. Then he arrived, a duke wrapped in shadows and sorrow, a man no one dared approach. Their eyes met in a moonlit garden, and something ancient stirred between them. He saw her, truly saw her. And when his lips brushed her ear in a darkened library, whispering words that made her soul tremble, Lillian Ashford understood that some destinies cannot be denied. But the world that had kept her in the shadows would not let her go without a fight. The morning light filtering through Ravensmere Hall's windows held no warmth for Lillian Ashford. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, carrying linens that were not truly her responsibility, enduring tasks designed solely to remind her of her place. 24 years of existence, and she had learned that invisibility was survival. The scent of beeswax and lavender clung to the polished floors as she descended the servants' staircase. Her grey dress whispered against the stone steps, a sound so familiar it had become the rhythm of her life. Above, in the grand rooms where sunlight painted everything gold, the legitimate family prepared for another day of effortless privilege. Lady Margaret's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade through silk. The mistress of Ravensmere Hall stood at the entrance to the morning room, her burgundy dress a studied reminder of the hierarchy between them. Her fingers drummed against the doorframe with practiced impatience. "You are late, Lillian. Lady Cordelia has been waiting this quarter hour for assistance with her correspondence." Lillian curtsied, eyes lowered to the Turkish carpet beneath her feet. "Forgive me, my lady. I was attending to the linens as requested. The linens can wait." "My daughter cannot." Lady Margaret's tone carried the particular cruelty of someone who knew exactly how much power they wielded. "Or have you forgotten that you exist here only by our charity?" The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of shame that Lillian had learned to absorb without flinching. She was the late Earl of Ashford's unacknowledged mistake, the child born of a brief passion with a governess who died bringing her into the world. Her father had provided for her education before his own death 3 years ago, but his legitimate family had been horrified to discover her existence in his will. "No, my lady, I have not forgotten. See that you do not." Lady Margaret turned away, dismissing her with a gesture that made Lillian feel smaller than the dust motes dancing in the morning light. "And ensure your hands are clean before touching Cordelia's stationery. We cannot have ink-stained fingers sullying the Ashford crest." Lillian climbed the grand staircase, her hand barely grazing the mahogany banister that generations of true Ashfords had gripped with ownership. The portraits lining the walls watched her ascent with painted eyes that seemed to judge her unworthiness with every step. Her father's portrait hung at the landing, his kind eyes the only warmth in this house of cold marble and colder hearts. She paused before it, as she did every morning. He had visited her twice before his death, bringing books and speaking to her as if she mattered, as if her mind was worth cultivating. Those moments felt like dreams now, too fragile to have been real. Lady Cordelia's chamber smelled of rosewater and expensive French perfume. The young woman reclined on her chaise near the window, 22 years old and entirely confident in her position in the world. Her blonde hair caught the light in a way that seemed deliberately arranged, and her morning dress of pale blue muslin had probably cost more than Lillian would see in a year. "You took long enough." Cordelia did not look up from examining her perfectly manicured nails. "I require you to copy these invitations. My hand cramps so easily and your penmanship is adequate for such mundane tasks." Lillian settled at the writing desk positioned away from the window, where the light was dimmer and the chair less comfortable. She organized the ivory stationery with careful precision, preparing the ink and selecting the appropriate pen. Years of similar tasks had made her movements efficient, almost mechanical. "We are expecting a guest of considerable importance," Cordelia announced, her voice carrying a note of excitement that made Lillian's stomach tighten with apprehension. "The Duke of Ashbourne himself has requested accommodation at Ravensmere for a fortnight." Lillian's hand paused over the first invitation. The Duke of Ashbourne was a name spoken in hushed tones, even in servant quarters. Powerful beyond measure, wealthy beyond imagination, and marked by a tragedy that had made him retreat from society 5 years prior. His young wife had died under mysterious circumstances, and he had not been seen at any social gathering since. Why would such a man come here? The question escaped before Lillian could stop it. Cordelia's eyes narrowed dangerously. That is hardly your concern. You would do well to remember that companions do not question their betters. Now write, and do not smudge the ink as you did last time. The morning stretched into afternoon as Lillian copied invitation after invitation in her careful script. Her back ached from the rigid posture required, and her fingers cramped around the pen, but she did not complain. Complaint was a luxury afforded only to those who had choices. Through the window she could see the gardens where she sometimes walked in the early mornings before the household stirred. That stolen time among the roses and lavender was her only freedom, her only moment of peace in a life designed to diminish her. "You may go," Cordelia finally announced, waving her hand in dismissal without even glancing at the completed work. "Leave the invitations on the desk and ensure you are presentable for dinner tonight. We cannot have you looking like a dusty relic when His Grace arrives tomorrow." Lillian gathered her materials and left the room with a curtsy that had become second nature. The corridor outside felt cooler, the air easier to breathe without Cordelia's perfume overwhelming her senses. She made her way toward the library, the one place in this vast house where she felt something approaching comfort. The library had been her sanctuary since childhood. Its walls of leather-bound volumes held worlds she could escape into, knowledge that no one could take from her. She ran her fingers along the spines as she walked, feeling the raised letters and worn leather like old friends greeting her touch. She selected a volume on astronomy and settled into the window seat hidden behind the heavy curtains. Here, tucked away from view, she could read without interruption. The afternoon light slanted across the pages as she lost herself in descriptions of distant stars and mathematical calculations that made sense in ways human cruelty never would. The sound of footsteps approaching made her freeze. She held her breath, hoping whoever it was would not discover her hiding place. The library was technically open to her use, but she had learned that her presence anywhere was often considered an intrusion. "Miss Ashford." The housekeeper's voice carried a note of urgency. "Miss Ashford, are you here?" Reluctantly, Lillian emerged from behind the curtains, marking her place in the book with a ribbon. "Yes, Mrs. Brennan?" The housekeeper's expression was troubled. "Lady Margaret requires you in the drawing room immediately. There has been some confusion regarding the arrangements for His Grace's visit." Lillian's heart sank, but she nodded and followed Mrs. Brennan through the corridors. The drawing room was in chaos when they arrived. Lady Margaret stood at the centre, directing servants with sharp commands, while Lord Edmund, the current Earl and Lillian's half-brother, paced near the fireplace with obvious agitation. "You summoned me, my lady?" Lillian kept her voice carefully neutral. Lady Margaret's gaze swept over her with visible disdain. "The Duke's correspondence indicates he requires access to the estate's financial records during his stay. You will prepare the account books for his review. I trust you remember enough of your father's tedious lessons in mathematics to organize them properly." The insult was deliberate, designed to remind everyone in the room that Lillian's education had been an extravagance wasted on someone of her station. But it also presented an opportunity. The account books were kept in the small office adjoining the library, a space where she might work undisturbed. "Yes, my lady, I will see to it immediately. See that you do." "And Lillian?" Lady Margaret's voice stopped her at the door. "The Duke must not be troubled by your presence during his stay. You will take your meals in your chamber and remain out of sight unless specifically summoned for a task. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, my lady." The dismissal was clear. Lillian retreated to the office, closing the door behind her with a soft click that felt like a small rebellion. The account books lined the shelves in chronological order, their leather bindings stamped with the Ashford crest that she had no right to claim. As she began pulling volumes from the shelves, preparing them for the Duke's inspection, Lillian allowed herself a moment of curiosity about the man who would arrive tomorrow. What business could the Duke of Ashbourne possibly have with Ravensmere's finances? What brought a man of his stature to this house of small cruelties and smaller kindnesses? The setting sun painted the office walls amber and gold, and for a moment Lillian let herself imagine a different life, one where she was not invisible, not tolerated, not diminished with every breath she took in this house that should have been her home. But imagination changed nothing. Tomorrow the Duke would arrive. The household would perform its carefully rehearsed dance of propriety, and she would remain what she had always been. The girl no one wanted to see. She opened the first account book and began her work, the scratch of her pen against paper, the only sound in the gathering darkness. Outside, the gardens she loved so much faded into shadow, and somewhere in the house above, the legitimate family prepared for the arrival of a man whose presence would change everything. Though Lillian did not know it yet, her life of invisibility was about to end in the most unexpected way possible. The household transformed overnight into something Lillian barely recognized. Servants polished silver that already gleamed, arranged flowers in every conceivable corner, and moved through the corridors with an urgency that bordered on panic. The Duke of Ashbourne's impending arrival had turned Ravensmere Hall into a stage, and everyone was desperate to play their part perfectly. Lillian worked in the small office adjoining the library, organizing the financial records as instructed. The account books spread before her told stories in neat columns of numbers, stories of prosperity and expenditure, of careful management and occasional extravagance. She lost herself in the mathematics, finding comfort in their absolute truth. Numbers did not lie. Numbers did not judge. The sound of carriages arriving pulled her attention to the window. Through the wavy glass, she watched the household staff line up in perfect formation along the drive. Lady Margaret stood at the centre, her posture rigid with anticipation. Lord Edmund adjusted his cravat repeatedly, his nervous energy visible even from this distance. But it was not the Duke's carriage that had arrived. Only advanced servants, footmen in livery finer than anything Ravensmere employed, unloading trunks and cases with practiced efficiency. The Duke himself would not arrive until evening, she had overheard Mrs. Brennan mention. Lillian returned to her work, but concentration proved elusive. Something about the Duke's visit unsettled her in ways she could not name. Why would a man of his position concern himself with the financial records of a minor estate? What connection could he possibly have to Ravensmere Hall? The afternoon faded into dusk, and still she worked. The office grew dim, but she lit only a single candle, unwilling to draw attention to her presence. Through the walls she could hear the household preparing for dinner, a formal affair despite the Duke's absence, a rehearsal for the performances to come. "Miss Ashford." Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway, her expression kind but firm. "You should retire to your chamber now. His Grace is expected within the hour, and Lady Margaret was quite clear about your absence during his arrival." Of course. Lillian gathered the books she had been reviewing, organizing them with careful precision. "I have prepared the records as requested. They are complete and in order." Mrs. Brennan's eyes held sympathy that made Lillian's throat tighten. "You are a clever girl, miss. Your father would have been proud of the woman you have become." The unexpected kindness nearly undid her composure. Lillian managed a small smile and slipped past the housekeeper, making her way toward the servants' stairs that would take her to her small chamber in the east wing. But as she passed through the corridor, something drew her toward the windows overlooking the main entrance. She should not linger. She should obey Lady Margaret's directive and disappear. But curiosity, that dangerous, persistent thing, rooted her feet to the carpet. The sun had set completely now, and torches blazed along the drive, turning the approaching carriage into something from a dream. It was black as midnight, pulled by 4 magnificent horses whose coats gleamed like polished onyx. The Ashbourne crest blazed in gold on the door, a phoenix rising from flames. The household stood at attention as the carriage rolled to a stop. Footmen rushed forward to open the door, and for a moment, nothing happened. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then he emerged. Even from her hidden vantage point, Lillian felt the impact of his presence. The Duke of Ashbourne stood well over 6 feet, his frame broad-shouldered beneath a perfectly tailored black coat. His hair was dark as the carriage that had brought him, and even in the flickering torchlight, she could see the sharp angles of his face, a face that might have been carved from granite for all the warmth it displayed. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. Even at this distance, even in the uncertain light, she saw their intensity. They swept over the assembled household with an assessment that seemed to measure and dismiss in equal measure. This was a man accustomed to power, to deference, to getting exactly what he wanted. Lady Margaret curtsied deeply, her rehearsed greeting carrying up to where Lillian stood transfixed. "Your Grace, Ravensmere Hall is honoured beyond measure by your presence. We have prepared—" The Duke raised one hand, silencing her mid-sentence with a gesture so slight it might have been imagined. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and precise, each word chosen with evident care. "I require only basic accommodations and access to your library and records. I am not here for entertainments, Lady Margaret. I am here to work." The dismissal was absolute. Lady Margaret's face flushed, though whether from embarrassment or anger, Lillian could not tell. Lord Edmund stepped forward, attempting to salvage the moment with excessive courtesy, but the Duke was already moving toward the entrance, his stride purposeful and unyielding. Lillian knew she should flee now, before anyone noticed her watching. But something kept her frozen as the Duke paused at the threshold of Ravensmere Hall. He turned, his gaze sweeping the facade of the house with an expression she could not read. And then, impossibly, his eyes lifted to her window. For one breathless moment, their gazes locked across the distance and darkness. Lillian's heart stuttered in her chest. He could not possibly see her clearly. She stood in shadow, the room behind her unlit. Yet she felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch, as if those dark eyes could pierce through stone and glass and secrets. Then he turned away and disappeared into the house, leaving Lillian trembling against the window frame, with a pulse that raced for reasons she dared not examine. She fled to her chamber, closing the door behind her with shaking hands. The small room felt even smaller tonight, the walls pressing in with the weight of questions she could not answer. Why had his gaze affected her so profoundly? Why did she feel as though something fundamental had shifted in the moment their eyes met? Sleep proved impossible. Lillian lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while the house settled around her. She could hear the muffled sounds of the household far below, the Duke being shown to his chambers, servants moving with careful quiet, the normal rhythms of Ravensmere adjusting to accommodate this powerful stranger. Near midnight, she gave up on sleep entirely. The gardens called to her, promising the peace she desperately needed. She dressed in her plainest gown and wrapped a dark shawl around her shoulders, then slipped through the silent corridors with the practiced stealth of someone accustomed to moving unseen. The gardens smelled of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. A full moon painted everything silver, transforming familiar paths into something magical and strange. Lillian walked toward her favorite spot, a stone bench hidden among the roses, where the fountain's gentle splash masked all other sounds. She sat and let the night air cool her flushed cheeks. This was foolishness. The Duke was nothing to her, and she was less than nothing to him. Tomorrow he would begin whatever mysterious business had brought him to Ravensmere, and she would return to her invisible existence. Their paths would never cross. The sound of footsteps on gravel froze her breath. Someone else walked the gardens at this midnight hour. Someone whose stride was confident even in darkness, whose presence seemed to alter the very air. Lillian pressed herself against the roses, thorns catching at her shawl, hoping the shadows would hide her as they always had. But the footsteps did not pass. They stopped near the fountain, close enough that she could hear the quiet intake of breath, the rustle of expensive fabric. And then, his voice, speaking into the darkness with a weariness that made him suddenly, startlingly human. 5 years I have searched. 5 years of shadows and secrets and dead ends. Let this be the place. Let this finally be where truth lives. Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs. She should announce her presence or flee or do anything except remain frozen like a thief, stealing moments not meant for her. But before she could move, he spoke again, and this time his voice carried something else, something that sounded almost like pain. "Catherine, if you can hear me wherever you are, forgive me. Forgive me for failing you. Forgive me for what I must do to find the truth." The raw emotion in his words struck Lillian like a blow. This was not the cold, commanding Duke who had dismissed Lady Margaret with a gesture. This was a man haunted by loss, driven by guilt, searching for something he feared he would never find. She must have made some small sound, a sharp breath, a rustle of fabric, because suddenly his attention snapped toward her hiding place with predatory focus. "Who is there? Show yourself." For a moment, Lillian considered fleeing. But dignity, that small, stubborn thing she had clung to through years of humiliation, would not let her run like a frightened rabbit. She rose from the bench and stepped into the moonlight, her chin raised, despite the fear coursing through her veins. The Duke stared at her, and she watched recognition dawn in his eyes. He had seen her at the window. He knew she had watched his arrival, and now she had witnessed his moment of private grief. "You." His voice was carefully controlled now, all emotion locked away behind walls of aristocratic reserve. "You were at the window earlier." "Yes, Your Grace." Lillian curtsied, though her legs trembled with the effort. "I apologize for the intrusion. I could not sleep, and sought solace in the gardens. I did not know anyone else would be here." He studied her with an intensity that made her feel exposed despite being fully clothed. In the moonlight, his features were even more striking than she had realized. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and those eyes that seemed to see far too much. "You are not a servant," he said finally. "Your bearing, your speech, you are gentry, yet you hide in shadows like someone with no right to the light." The observation cut deeper than any of Lady Margaret's deliberate cruelties. "I am Lillian Ashford, Your Grace, companion to Lady Cordelia." Ashford. He repeated her name as if tasting it, and something flickered in his expression. "The late Earl's daughter." His natural daughter, she corrected, surprised by her own boldness. The one he should not have acknowledged, but did. The mistake that haunts this house. The Duke took a step closer, and Lillian fought the urge to retreat. The scent of sandalwood and something darker, smoke perhaps or aged whiskey, drifted from him. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, and the difference in their positions felt suddenly acutely meaningful. "I think, Miss Ashford, that you are not a mistake at all." His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, intimate in a way that made her skin flush. "I think you are exactly where you need to be. And I think fate has a curious sense of timing." Before she could respond, before she could even process the strange intensity of his words, he stepped back and offered her a slight bow, a gesture of respect that no one at Ravensmere had ever shown her. "Return to your chamber, Miss Ashford. Tomorrow our paths will cross again, and when they do, everything will change." Then he was gone, striding back toward the house with purposeful steps that left Lillian alone in the moonlit garden, her heart racing and her mind spinning with questions that had no answers. What did he mean? How could he know their paths would cross? And why did his presence ignite something in her that felt dangerously like hope? She returned to her chamber as dawn painted the sky pink and gold, knowing that sleep would still not come. The Duke's words echoed in her mind, a promise and a threat wrapped in silk and shadow. Everything will change. And somehow, impossibly, Lillian believed him. Morning arrived with exhaustion pressing against Lillian's temples. She had managed perhaps 2 hours of restless sleep before duties demanded her presence. The house buzzed with nervous energy, servants whispering about the Duke's coldness, his request to work undisturbed in the library. The library, where she had left the account books perfectly arranged for his review. By midday, Lillian could bear it no longer. She needed to retrieve a book she had left there, a volume on mathematics that belonged in her chamber, not where the Duke might discover it, and question why a mere companion possessed such interests. She made her way through the corridors, pausing outside the library doors. She turned the handle slowly, wincing at the soft click that seemed thunderous in the quiet. The Duke stood before the tall windows, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. He had removed his coat, working in shirt sleeves and waistcoat, an informality that seemed shockingly intimate. The white linen stretched across his broad shoulders, and Lillian found herself transfixed. "Did you think I would not hear you, Miss Ashford?" His voice carried quiet amusement. "You move remarkably quietly for someone who does not wish to be invisible." She froze in the doorway. "I apologize, Your Grace. I left a book here yesterday and thought to retrieve it without disturbing your work." He turned to face her, and the morning light revealed details she had missed in the moonlit garden. His eyes were the deepest brown she had ever seen, the color of rich earth after rain, and they held an intelligence that seemed to see through every wall she had built. "Come in. Close the door behind you." The command should have frightened her, but something in his tone compelled her obedience. She stepped inside and pushed the door closed with a soft click that sounded like sealing a bargain. "Your book." He gestured to the desk where her mathematics volume lay open beside the account books. "You were studying differential equations, advanced work for a companion. My father believed education was not wasted on daughters, legitimate or otherwise. Your father was a wise man." He moved toward the desk, his fingers trailing across the open pages. "These notes in the margins, they are yours?" "Yes, Your Grace. You found an error in the original calculation." He tapped the page where she had penciled a correction. "The author missed a critical variable." "You did not." Pride warmed her chest. "I have always found comfort in numbers, Your Grace. They are honest in ways people rarely are." Something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps, or understanding. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jawline. "I have reviewed the account books you prepared." His voice dropped lower, intimate in the book-lined space. "They are impeccable, but they also reveal something troubling. There are discrepancies, funds allocated for improvements that show no corresponding work, payments to vendors who do not exist. Someone has been stealing from this estate for years, Miss Ashford. Why are you telling me this?" The question escaped as a whisper. "I am no one." He stepped closer still, near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, her back pressed against the bookshelf behind her. He raised one hand slowly and traced his fingers along the edge of the shelf beside her head. The gesture caged her without touching, and her breath caught. "You are not no one." His voice was velvet and smoke. "You are brilliant. You are brave enough to correct published mathematicians in the margins of books. And you are trapped in a house that fears your intelligence more than it values your blood. How do you know these things?" Her voice trembled. "You arrived only yesterday. I know because I see you." His free hand rose to her face, and this time he did touch her. His fingers brushed her cheek with devastating gentleness, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "When everyone else in this house looks through you as if you were glass, I see you, Lillian Ashford. I see exactly who you are." His use of her given name felt like a violation and a gift simultaneously. No one called her Lillian, but on his lips, her name sounded like something precious. Why? The single word carried all her confusion. "Why do you see me?" The Duke leaned closer, his breath warm against her temple. His hand slid from her cheek to cup the back of her neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin there with a touch that made her knees weaken. "Because," he whispered directly into her ear, his lips brushing the delicate shell, "my destiny was to find you." The words shattered something inside her. Every wall she had built crumbled beneath that confession. Her hands rose of their own accord, fisting in his waistcoat, anchoring herself to him as the world tilted. "I do not understand." Tears spilled over now, hot against her cheeks. "You speak in riddles. You barely know me. I know enough." His other hand found her waist, steadying her against him. "I know your father was my friend. I know he wrote to me before his death, begging me to ensure you were cared for. I know his family has betrayed that trust. And I know that from the moment I saw you in that window, something in me recognized something in you." The revelation crashed over her like a wave. Her father had known him, had trusted him, had tried to protect her even from beyond the grave. Oscar. He said his own name like an offering. "When we are alone, you will call me Oscar, not Your Grace, just my name, as if we were equals. But we are not equals." The protest was automatic. "You are a duke. I am nothing." His hand tightened on her waist, pulling her fully against him. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest, the rapid beat of his heart that matched her own. "You are everything." The words were fierce, almost angry. "And before this is finished, the entire world will know it." The library door burst open. Lady Margaret stood in the doorway, her face contorted with rage barely contained. Behind her, Lord Edmund and Lady Cordelia crowded the threshold. "Your Grace." Lady Margaret's voice could have frozen summer itself. "Miss Ashford has clearly forgotten her place. She will be disciplined immediately." Oscar did not release Lillian. Instead, his arm tightened around her waist, claiming her publicly. Miss Ashford was assisting me with the account books at my request. Her knowledge of mathematics and estate management is exceptional. I will require her presence in the library for the duration of my stay. "That is highly irregular," Lord Edmund began, but Oscar silenced him with a look. "I did not ask your opinion, Edmund. Miss Ashford will work with me alone, without interruption. Is that understood?" The use of Edmund's given name without title was a calculated insult. Edmund's face flushed crimson, but he nodded stiffly. Lady Margaret's lips thinned to a bloodless line. "Of course, Your Grace, but I must insist on proper chaperonage." "No." Oscar's single word cut through her protest. "You will insist on nothing. You will leave us to our work, and you will ensure we are not disturbed again." The humiliation nearly broke Lady Margaret's composure entirely, but she managed a jerky acknowledgement and retreated. The door closed behind them with a decisive click. Lillian found herself trembling in Oscar's arms. "They will make me pay for this. They will find ways to punish me that you cannot prevent." Oscar turned her to face him fully, both hands cupping her face. "They will try. But Lillian, understand this. I did not come here merely to review account books. I came here to expose thieves and restore what was stolen. And what was stolen includes your birthright, your dignity, and your future." His thumb brushed away her tears with infinite care. "Trust me." "Can you do that?" Lillian looked into his eyes and saw truth there, complicated, fierce, and absolutely certain. This man had been her father's friend. This man had come because her father had asked. Yes, the word was barely a breath. "I trust you." Oscar pressed his forehead to hers, his eyes closing briefly. "Then we begin. And Lillian, when this is over, you will never be invisible again." The hours that followed transformed Lillian's existence in ways she could scarcely comprehend. No longer relegated to shadowy corners and menial tasks, she sat beside Oscar in the library as an equal, poring over ledgers and correspondence that revealed the systematic theft of her inheritance. The autumn sun streamed through the tall windows, painting the mahogany desk in warm gold. Oscar had rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle as he made notes in his precise handwriting. Lillian tried to focus on the columns of numbers before her, but her awareness of him was a constant distraction, the scent of sandalwood and ink, the quiet intensity of his concentration, the way his jaw tightened when he discovered another discrepancy. "Here." She pointed to an entry in the ledger from 18 months prior. "This payment to Harrington Mills for roof repairs." There were no roof repairs that year. "I remember because the east wing leaked terribly that winter, and Lady Margaret complained daily, but refused to authorize the expense." Oscar leaned closer to examine the entry, his shoulder brushing hers. The contact sent heat through her body, despite the layers of fabric between them. "Show me the corresponding entries in the household accounts." Lillian retrieved the secondary ledger, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the pages. There, no mention of Harrington Mills in the household records. The payment exists only in the estate accounts, which means the money never went to repairs. Oscar's voice was grim. It went directly into someone's pocket, and Harrington Mills likely does not exist or is complicit in the fraud. They worked in focused silence, building a pattern of theft that spanned 5 years. With each discovery, Lillian felt anger replacing the shame she had carried for so long. This was not merely financial impropriety. This was the systematic plundering of her father's legacy, of the inheritance that should have secured her future. "You have a gift for this." Oscar's observation broke through her concentration. "Most people see numbers as abstract symbols. You see the stories they tell, the lies they conceal. My father used to say that mathematics was the language of truth." She met his eyes, surprised to find admiration there rather than the condescension she had learned to expect. "He taught me that numbers cannot be charmed or flattered or manipulated by social position. They simply are. Your father understood you." Oscar reached across the desk, his hand covering hers where it rested on the ledger. His touch was warm, deliberate, and entirely improper for two people working in an unchaperoned room. "He knew what a rare mind you possess." Lillian's breath caught. No one had ever called her mind rare or precious or worth cultivating beyond the basic skills required of a companion. Oscar's thumb stroked across her knuckles with a tenderness that made her heart race. "Why are you doing this?" The question emerged as barely a whisper. "You could expose the theft without involving me. You could speak to magistrates, conduct your investigation, and leave me safely invisible as I have always been. Because you deserve to be visible." His other hand rose to cup her cheek, tilting her face toward his. "Because your father asked me to protect you and I failed him by arriving too late. Because when I look at you, I see not just brilliance but courage. You have survived years of cruelty without letting them break your spirit." The intensity in his gaze stole her capacity for speech. He was so close now that she could see the darker rim around his irises, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. His thumb traced her cheekbone with exquisite gentleness, and because, he continued, his voice dropping to something intimate and rough, "When I touch you, I feel something I thought died with Catherine. Something I did not believe I would ever feel again." The mention of his late wife should have created distance between them. Instead, it felt like trust, a sharing of pain that made the moment more profound. Lillian turned her face into his palm, her eyes closing briefly at the simple comfort of his touch. "What do you feel?" She dared the question, needing to hear him name this thing growing between them. "Hope." The single word carried the weight of years. "Hope that perhaps my life is not finished, that perhaps I was meant to find you, to help you, to—" The sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. Oscar withdrew his hand smoothly, returning his attention to the ledgers as if nothing had passed between them. But Lillian could still feel the ghost of his touch on her skin, could still see the hunger in his eyes that matched the ache building in her own chest. Lady Cordelia entered without knocking, her expression petulant. "Mother insists you join us for tea, Lillian. It is improper for you to spend entire days closeted with His Grace without proper supervision. The Duke requires my assistance with the estate accounts." Lillian kept her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I cannot abandon the work at your mother's convenience." Cordelia's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You forget yourself. You are a companion, not an accountant. Your first duty is to my family." Oscar rose from his chair with fluid grace, his full height and commanding presence filling the room. "Miss Ashford's first duty is to truth and justice, Lady Cordelia. She is helping me expose financial irregularities that concern the late Earl's estate. Unless you wish to explain to magistrates why you find that work less important than tea, I suggest you inform your mother that Miss Ashford is occupied indefinitely." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Cordelia's face flushed crimson, and for a moment Lillian thought she might explode with rage. But even Cordelia was not foolish enough to challenge a duke openly. "Of course, Your Grace." Cordelia's curtsy was barely civil. "I shall inform Mother." As she departed, her skirt swishing with indignation, Oscar returned to his seat and met Lillian's gaze with a slight smile that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish. "You enjoy antagonizing them." Lillian could not quite keep the wonder from her voice. "I enjoy defending you." He picked up his pen, returning to his notes. "There is considerable difference. They will retaliate." Fear crept into her words. "They will find ways to make me pay for this presumption. Let them try." Oscar's tone carried absolute certainty. "By the time I finish gathering evidence, they will have far greater concerns than your presumption." The afternoon wore on, and with each hour, Lillian felt the boundaries of her world expanding. Oscar asked her opinion on complex financial matters, listened to her observations as if they carried weight, and treated her not as an illegitimate burden, but as a valuable partner in his investigation. When the dinner hour approached, he insisted she join the family at table rather than taking her usual meal in isolation. The prospect terrified her, but Oscar's steady presence at her side gave her courage she had not known she possessed. The dining room felt oppressively formal, candles casting flickering shadows across the faces of those who had spent years ensuring her insignificance. Lady Margaret sat at the head of the table, her expression glacial. Lord Edmund occupied his father's former seat, looking deeply uncomfortable. Cordelia glared at Lillian with unveiled hostility. Oscar held Lillian's chair, a gesture of respect that made Lady Margaret's lips thin to invisibility. Throughout the meal, he directed conversation toward the estate's management, asking pointed questions about expenditures and improvements that forced increasingly uncomfortable responses. Lillian watched the power dynamics shift with each carefully worded inquiry. Oscar wielded courtesy like a weapon, his aristocratic bearing and ducal authority making every question an implicit accusation. And when Lady Margaret attempted to dismiss Lillian from the table early, Oscar's quiet objection carried such weight that even the mistress of Ravensmere Hall was forced to yield. As the final course concluded, Oscar rose and offered Lillian his arm. "I require Miss Ashford's assistance with additional records this evening. We will work late, so please do not wait up." The impropriety of the statement hung in the air like smoke. An unmarried woman, working late into the night alone with a man, even one of Oscar's rank, it violated every rule of decent society. But none of them dared protest. In the corridor outside the dining room, safely away from listening ears, Oscar paused and turned to Lillian. His hand still held her arm, warm through the fabric of her sleeve. "You did beautifully." Pride colored his words. "You sat at that table as if you belonged there, because you do belong there. This is your home, Lillian. Your inheritance, and I will not rest until everyone acknowledges that truth." Lillian looked up at him, this powerful man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she had been too afraid to voice. The candlelight played across his features, softening the harsh angles and revealing something tender beneath his controlled exterior. Oscar. His name felt dangerous and delicious on her tongue. "What happens when you finish your investigation? When the truth is exposed and justice is served?" His hand rose to her face, cradling her jaw with devastating gentleness. "Then, Lillian Ashford, you will be free to choose your own future, and I very much hope you will choose one that includes me." Before she could respond, before she could process the enormity of what he implied, he pressed a kiss to her forehead, soft, reverent, and achingly brief. Then he stepped back, breaking the contact that had set her entire body aflame. "Come, we have work to do, and much to prepare before we bring this house of lies crashing down." As they returned to the library, Lillian felt the weight of destiny pressing against her ribs. Whatever came next would change everything. The invisible girl was stepping into the light, and there would be no going back to the shadows she had once called safety. The formal dinner party arrived with the weight of an execution. Lady Margaret had planned the event weeks prior, an opportunity to showcase Ravensmere Hall to the local gentry and secure advantageous connections for Cordelia. The Duke's presence transformed it into something else entirely, a stage upon which truth would be laid bare. Lillian dressed with trembling hands in the only evening gown she possessed, a simple dress of deep green silk that had belonged to her mother. Oscar had insisted she attend, and his word carried more authority than all of Lady Margaret's protests combined. The drawing room glittered with candlelight and crystalline laughter. Titled families from neighboring estates filled the space, their jewels catching the light as they traded gossip and assessed one another's worth. Lillian entered quietly, intending to fade into the shadows as she always had. But Oscar found her immediately, crossing the crowded room with purposeful strides that drew every eye. He took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her gloved knuckles that sent whispers rippling through the assembly like wind through wheat. "Miss Ashford." His voice carried clearly, ensuring everyone heard. "I have been waiting for you." The room fell silent. Lillian felt the weight of dozens of gazes, some curious, some scandalized, all astonished to see the Duke of Ashbourne showing such marked attention to someone of her ambiguous position. Lady Margaret materialized at Oscar's elbow, her smile brittle as winter ice. "Your Grace, perhaps you are not aware that Miss Ashford is merely a companion in this household. Surely there are more suitable partners for your attention this evening." Oscar turned to her with a look that could have frozen the sun. "I'm entirely aware of Miss Ashford's position, Lady Margaret. I'm also aware that she possesses one of the finest mathematical minds I have encountered, regardless of gender or station. Her contributions to my investigation of the estate finances have been invaluable." The emphasis on investigation sent visible ripples of discomfort through the family. Lord Edmund's face paled, and Cordelia gripped her fan with white-knuckled intensity. "Investigation, Your Grace?" Lord Pemberton, a neighbouring earl, stepped forward with evident interest. "Is there some irregularity at Ravensmere?" "Irregularities," Oscar corrected with subtle emphasis. "Multiple and significant, which is precisely why I have asked Miss Ashford to prepare a presentation of her findings for this evening's entertainment." The pronouncement landed like a grenade in a china shop. Lady Margaret's composure cracked visibly, her eyes widening with panic barely concealed behind aristocratic hauteur. Lillian herself felt dizzy with the audacity of what Oscar proposed. "Your Grace, surely this is not appropriate dinner conversation," Lady Margaret began, but Oscar silenced her with a raised hand. "On the contrary, I find financial accountability entirely appropriate when discussing estate management, unless you have some objection to transparency." The trap was perfect. To object would suggest guilt. To permit it would expose the truth. Lady Margaret had no winning move, and from the furious desperation in her eyes, she knew it. Dinner proceeded with tension thick enough to choke. Lillian sat beside Oscar at the long table, acutely aware of hostile glares from the family and curious scrutiny from guests who sensed scandal brewing. Oscar remained perfectly composed, his occasional glances toward her carrying warmth that steadied her racing heart. When the final course concluded and guests gathered in the drawing room, Oscar rose and called for attention. The room quieted immediately, everyone leaning forward with barely concealed anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have called you here this evening not merely for social pleasure but to bear witness to an injustice that has persisted far too long." He gestured to Lillian. "Miss Ashford, if you would be so kind." Lillian rose on legs that trembled beneath her skirts. Oscar had prepared her for this moment, but preparation did nothing to ease the terror of standing before the assembled elite, who had spent years looking through her as if she were glass. She moved to the escritoire where Oscar had arranged the damning ledgers and documents. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but steady, the voice of someone who had learned to find strength in truth rather than approval. "For the past 5 years, the Ravensmere estate has been systematically defrauded." She opened the first ledger, her finger tracing the columns with practiced precision. Payments recorded to vendors who do not exist. Repairs documented that were never performed. Income from tenant farms that somehow never reached the estate coffers. The room erupted in whispers. Lillian pressed forward, her confidence growing with each revelation. Lord Pemberton rose and approached the desk, examining the documents with an accountant's eye. Other guests followed, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock as the evidence mounted. "This is preposterous," Lord Edmund finally found his voice. "This girl knows nothing of estate management. She invents these accusations out of spite and jealousy." Silence. Oscar's command cracked like a whip. "Lord Edmund, I would advise extreme caution in your next words. Miss Ashford's analysis is flawless, her evidence irrefutable. And her motives are beyond question, which is more than can be said for yours." He moved to stand beside Lillian, his presence a bulwark against the hostility radiating from the family. Every discrepancy she has identified can be verified through independent investigation. The question is not whether fraud occurred, but who committed it and why. Lady Margaret rose with shaking dignity. "Your Grace, you go too far. This is our home." "No." Oscar's voice cut through her protest with surgical precision. "This is Miss Lillian Ashford's home. Ravensmere Hall was left to her by her father, the late Earl, in a will that was concealed and suppressed by those who stood to gain from her ignorance." The revelation detonated like cannon fire. Gasps echoed through the drawing room. Lillian herself swayed, her vision blurring at the edges. Oscar's hand found her elbow, steadying her as the room spun. "That is a lie." Lady Margaret's composure shattered completely. The Earl left everything to Edmund, his legitimate heir. "This base-born girl has no claim. I have the will." Oscar withdrew a folded document from his coat, authenticated, witnessed, and legally binding. The late Earl left Ravensmere Hall and the bulk of his fortune to his daughter Lillian, with provisions for his son Edmund and widow Margaret. But the will was never filed with the courts. Instead, this family claimed everything and relegated the rightful heir to servitude in her own home. Lord Pemberton examined the will with growing outrage. This is unconscionable. If what His Grace claims is true, this constitutes fraud of the most egregious nature. It is true. Oscar's certainty filled the room, and the financial records Miss Ashford has so brilliantly analyzed prove that the theft continued long after the Earl's death. They have been stealing from her inheritance for 5 years. Lillian stood frozen as chaos erupted around her. Guests exclaimed in shock and indignation. Lady Margaret collapsed into a chair, her face ashen. Lord Edmund attempted to bluster his way through denials that rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. Through it all, Oscar remained beside her, his hand warm and solid on her arm, an anchor in the storm he had deliberately created on her behalf. As the evening dissolved into scandal and recrimination, as magistrates were summoned and accusations flew like daggers, Lillian felt something fundamental shift within her chest. The invisible girl had been dragged into blazing light, exposed before the very society that had enabled her oppression, and she was not invisible anymore. She was seen, acknowledged, and, for the first time in her life, believed. Oscar turned to her as guests departed in clusters of excited gossip, his dark eyes holding promises that made her heart race for entirely different reasons than fear. "You were magnificent." His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "You stood before them all and spoke truth with a courage that humbles me." I was terrified. The admission escaped as a whisper. "I know." His hand rose to her face, thumb brushing her cheek in a gesture that had become achingly familiar. "But you did it anyway. And tomorrow, when the magistrates arrive and the legal proceedings begin, you will do it again. Because you are not the girl they tried to make you. You are the woman your father knew you would become." As the drawing room emptied and the household dissolved into chaos, Lillian allowed herself one moment of pure feeling, standing in the wreckage of her former life, held steady by a man who had seen her worth when no one else would. The battle was not finished, but for the first time she believed she might actually win. If Lillian's courage is inspiring you, subscribe so you never miss a story like this. And I am curious, if you were standing in that moment of truth, what would you say to those who kept you invisible? Drop your answer in the comments below. The night after the dinner party, Ravensmere Hall transformed into a battlefield. Magistrates arrived at dawn, their carriages rolling up the drive with official authority that made servants whisper in corners. Lady Margaret retreated to her chambers, claiming illness. Lord Edmund paced the corridors with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. Lillian barely slept, her mind spinning with the magnitude of what had been revealed. She was not a tolerated burden. She was the rightful owner of this house, this estate, this life she had been denied. The knowledge sat strange and heavy in her chest, like wearing clothes tailored for someone else. Oscar had insisted she rest, but rest proved impossible. She rose before sunrise and made her way to the library, seeking comfort in the familiar scent of leather and paper. The account book still lay scattered across the desk, evidence of years of systematic theft. She was tracing her fingers across her father's signature in the will when the door burst open. Lady Margaret stood in the doorway, her usual composure shattered into something wild and dangerous. Behind her, Lord Edmund's face was mottled with rage barely contained. "You!" Lady Margaret's voice shook with venom. "You, ungrateful, conniving little wretch! After everything we did for you, giving you shelter and education and a position in this household, you gave me nothing." The words emerged with a calm that surprised Lillian herself. "You stole everything. My inheritance, my home, my dignity. You made me a servant in the house my father left to me. Your father was a fool who could not distinguish between legitimate children and base-born mistakes." Lady Margaret advanced into the room, her hands trembling with fury. "That will is a forgery. It must be. No man of sense would leave his estate to a bastard daughter over his rightful son. The magistrates have authenticated it." Lillian stood her ground, though fear coiled in her stomach. "Your theft is documented, witnessed, and criminal. No amount of denial will change that truth." Edmund stepped forward, his expression ugly with desperation. "Where is your Duke now, Miss Ashford? He rode out early this morning on business and left you alone with us." "How very convenient." The observation sent ice through Lillian's veins. Oscar had mentioned needing to consult with his solicitors, but she had not realized he would leave the estate entirely. Without his presence, she was vulnerable in ways that made her skin crawl with apprehension. "Get out!" Lady Margaret's voice dropped to something cold and final. "Pack your belongings and leave this house immediately. You are no longer welcome here. This is my house." Lillian lifted her chin despite the fear threatening to choke her. "The law has declared it so. You cannot expel me from my own property. Can we not?" Edmund moved closer, and Lillian instinctively retreated until her back hit the bookshelf. "The law moves slowly, Miss Ashford. And accidents happen so easily to young women living alone in hostile environments. A fall down the stairs, a fire in the night, so many tragic possibilities." The threat hung in the air like poison. Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized how precarious her position truly was. Oscar had exposed the truth, but he could not be everywhere. And these people had everything to lose. "You would not dare." Her voice emerged steadier than she felt. "The Duke would know. Everyone would know. The Duke is not here." Lady Margaret smiled, and it was a terrible thing to witness. "And by the time he returns, you will be gone. One way or another." Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway, her face pale with distress. "My lady, the magistrates wish to speak with you in the drawing room. Tell them I am indisposed." Lady Margaret did not take her eyes from Lillian. "And summon the footman. Miss Ashford is leaving immediately and will require assistance with her belongings." The next hours blurred into nightmare. Lillian was escorted to her small chamber by 2 footmen whose expressions held no sympathy. She packed her meager possessions with shaking hands: books her father had given her, her mother's locket, the few dresses that belonged to her rather than the household. As she descended the servants' stairs for the final time, clutching her single bag, she passed the portrait of her father. His painted eyes seemed to watch her exodus with sorrow that matched her own. The carriage waiting outside bore no Ashford crest, no mark of the estate. It was hired transport, the kind used for servants being dismissed without reference. The humiliation of it burned through Lillian's chest. "Where am I to go?" She addressed the question to Edmund, who supervised her departure with visible satisfaction. "That is no longer our concern." He gestured for the driver to proceed. "I suggest you find employment quickly. Women of uncertain virtue rarely fare well alone." As the carriage pulled away from Ravensmere Hall, Lillian watched through the window as the only home she had ever known receded into the distance. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them the satisfaction of her visible despair. The village of Ravensmere was small, its main street lined with shops and cottages that served the estate and surrounding farms. The carriage deposited Lillian at the posting inn, with instructions to the innkeeper that she would settle her own accommodation. The innkeeper, a weathered woman named Mrs. Fletcher, regarded Lillian with open curiosity. "You are from the Hall, are you not?" The Earl's natural daughter. The bluntness should have stung, but Lillian found herself grateful for honesty after years of whispered secrets. "Yes, I am Lillian Ashford. Heard there was trouble up at the big house. Magistrates and scandals." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes held sympathy rather than judgment. "You need a room then, if you have one available." Lillian counted the coins in her purse, pitifully few, barely enough for a week's lodging. "I can pay." Mrs. Fletcher quoted a price that was surprisingly reasonable, and when Lillian reached for her coins, the woman shook her head. "First week is settled already. Gentleman came through this morning, tall fellow with an air of authority about him. Said you might need sanctuary and left funds for your keep." Oscar. Relief and gratitude flooded through Lillian in equal measure. He had anticipated this, had known the family would retaliate, and had prepared for her safety, even as he attended to legal matters. Did he leave any message? The question emerged as barely a whisper. Mrs. Fletcher withdrew a sealed letter from her apron pocket. "Said to give you this the moment you arrived. And said to tell you that everything is proceeding according to plan, whatever that means." Lillian took the letter with trembling hands and retreated to the small but clean room Mrs. Fletcher provided. She broke the seal, with fingers that shook, unfolding the single page covered in Oscar's precise handwriting. "Dearest Lillian, If you are reading this, then events have unfolded as I feared they would. Do not be frightened. This expulsion is temporary, and the danger, while real, is manageable. I am meeting with my solicitors to accelerate the legal proceedings. By tomorrow evening at the latest, I will return with documents that will force the magistrates to act immediately. Your position will be secured, and those who have wronged you will face consequences. Stay at the inn. Do not venture out alone. Do not respond to any messages from Ravensmere Hall, regardless of what threats or promises they contain. I know you are afraid. I know this feels like defeat. But Lillian, you are not defeated. You are strategic. Sometimes the best way to win a battle is to retreat temporarily and let your enemies believe they have won. Trust me. Trust that I will return for you. Trust that everything I do is to ensure your safety and your future. And trust this, you are not alone, not anymore, not ever again. Yours in all things. Oscar. Lillian pressed the letter to her chest, tears finally spilling over to track down her cheeks. He had known, had planned for this, had ensured she would be safe even when he could not be physically present. The afternoon faded into evening, and Lillian sat by the window watching the village street below. Farmers returned from fields, shopkeepers closed their establishments, and normal life continued as if her entire world had not been upended. As darkness fell, a rider approached the inn at speed. Lillian's heart leapt, hoping it was Oscar returning early. But the figure that dismounted was smaller, cloaked and moving with furtive urgency. A knock at her door made her freeze. Mrs. Fletcher's voice called through the wood. "Miss Ashford? Message for you." "Young lad just brought it, said it was urgent." Lillian opened the door cautiously, accepting the sealed note Mrs. Fletcher offered. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper of poor quality. She broke the seal and read the message with growing dread. "Miss Ashford, you have made powerful enemies. The Duke cannot protect you forever, and accidents are so easily arranged. Leave England tonight, take what money you have and disappear. If you value your life, you will not wait for morning. Consider this your only warning." The note was unsigned, but the threat was clear. Someone wanted her frightened enough to flee before Oscar could return with legal protections. Whether the danger was real or fabricated to intimidate her, she could not be certain. Lillian moved to the window, her mind racing. Below, the village street was dark and quiet. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Oscar worked to secure her future. And here, alone in a rented room, she had to decide whether to trust his promise or succumb to the fear that whispered she would never truly be safe. She thought of her father's portrait, of his kind eyes that had promised she mattered. She thought of Oscar's words in the library. "You are everything." She thought of standing before the assembled elite and speaking truth despite her terror. Lillian Ashford had spent 24 years being invisible, being afraid, being diminished. And she discovered, in that moment of decision, that she was done running from the shadows that others tried to force upon her. She would wait for Oscar. She would trust his plan, and when he returned, they would face whatever came next together. The threatening note went into the fire, its lies consumed by flames. And Lillian settled in to wait for dawn, knowing that the real battle was only beginning. Oscar returned at midday, his arrival announced by the thunder of hooves and the urgent commotion that drew Lillian to her window. He dismounted before his horse fully stopped, his coat billowing behind him, as he strode toward the inn with barely contained fury. Lillian met him at the top of the stairs, and the relief that flooded his features when he saw her unharmed nearly brought her to tears. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that spoke of fear finally released. "Thank God." His voice was rough against her hair. "When I returned to find you gone, when they told me what they had done, I am safe." She pulled back enough to see his face, her hands gripping his coat. "Your letter found me. Your preparations saved me." Oscar's jaw tightened, and she could see the rage simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "They will answer for this. Every humiliation, every threat, every moment they made you feel less than what you are. But first, there is something you must know. The full truth." He guided her back into her room, closing the door before speaking again. His hands framed her face with desperate tenderness. "Lillian, Ravensmere Hall was always yours, but the theft goes deeper than financial fraud. Your father did not die of natural causes." The words struck like a physical blow. Lillian swayed, and Oscar's arms tightened around her, supporting her weight as the room tilted. "What are you saying?" Her voice emerged as barely a whisper. Oscar led her to the bed, settling beside her while maintaining his steadying hold. "Your father discovered the embezzlement 2 weeks before his death. He confronted Lady Margaret and Lord Edmund, threatened to expose them and disinherit Edmund entirely. 3 days later, he fell ill. The physician attributed it to his heart, but your father wrote to me in his final hours. He suspected poison." No. The denial was automatic, her mind refusing to accept such monstrous cruelty. They could not. They would not. They did. Oscar's certainty left no room for doubt. "I have spent the past year investigating, gathering evidence, following trails that led back to the physician who attended your father, a man who has since disappeared. Lady Margaret paid him handsomely to ensure the death appeared natural. Lillian felt something break open inside her chest. Grief and rage tangled together until she could not separate them. They murdered him, and then stole everything he tried to leave me." Yes, Oscar's thumb brushed away the tears spilling down her cheeks. "And they would have succeeded if your father had not written to me, if he had not hidden a second copy of his will with my solicitors, if he had not trusted me to ensure justice for you. Why did you wait so long?" The question carried no accusation, only desperate confusion. "If you knew, why did you not come sooner? Because I needed irrefutable proof." Oscar's voice was heavy with regret. "Suspicion is not evidence. I had to trace the financial crimes, locate witnesses, build a case that magistrates could not dismiss. Your father's death was ruled natural. To claim otherwise without absolute proof would have meant failure and would have put you in even greater danger. The magistrates know now?" Hope and fear warred in her chest. "They know everything." Oscar withdrew a thick folder of documents from his coat. Testimony from servants who witnessed the arguments. Records of the payments to the physician. Evidence of the suppressed will. And most damning, a letter your father managed to send me hours before he died, naming his suspicions and begging me to protect you. He unfolded the letter, and Lillian recognized her father's handwriting immediately, though it was shaky and desperate in a way that made her heart clench. "My dear friend Oscar, if you receive this, I am likely beyond help, but my daughter Lillian is not. They mean to steal everything from her. Her inheritance, her future, perhaps even her life if she proves inconvenient. I have made provisions, a second will with your solicitors, evidence of the embezzlement, but you must promise me, keep her safe. Do not let them make her invisible. She is brilliant and brave and worthy of so much more than the shadows they will try to force upon her. Protect her as I could not, and if possible, help her understand that she was loved, that she mattered, that her father's greatest regret was not having the courage to claim her publicly before it was too late." Your friend in desperation, James Lillian pressed her hand to her mouth, choking back sobs that threatened to overwhelm her. Her father had loved her, had fought for her even as he died, had trusted Oscar to finish what he could not. He wanted you to have everything. Oscar folded the letter carefully, returning it to his pocket. Not just the estate, but the acknowledgement he could not give you in life, legal recognition as his daughter, your rightful place in society. What happens now? She forced the words through tears that would not stop falling. Now we return to Ravensmere Hall with magistrates and witnesses. Oscar's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Lady Margaret and Lord Edmund will be arrested for fraud, embezzlement, and murder. The estate will be restored to you in its entirety. And you will never again be at anyone's mercy. They will fight. Fear crept into her voice despite her best efforts. They have connections, influence. I have more. Oscar's smile was cold and predatory. I am the Duke of Ashbourne, and I am claiming you under my personal protection. Any who move against you move against me. And Lillian, I promise you, no one will dare. The carriage ride back to Ravensmere felt surreal. Oscar sat beside her, his hand covering hers with protective warmth. Behind them, a second carriage carried magistrates and constables armed with arrest warrants. As they approached the estate, Lillian saw servants gathered on the steps, their faces reflecting confusion and fear. Mrs. Brennan stood among them, her expression brightening when she saw Lillian emerge from the carriage. The confrontation in the drawing room was swift and brutal. Lady Margaret attempted hauteur, then denial, then hysteria as the evidence mounted. Lord Edmund tried to flee and was restrained by constables who showed no sympathy for his protests. "You have no proof." Lady Margaret's voice rose to a shriek. "This is persecution based on the ravings of a base-born nobody. I have testimony from the maid who witnessed you adding powder to the Earl's evening tea." Oscar's voice cut through her denial like steel. "I have the physician's confession, obtained before his convenient disappearance. Can I have your own financial records showing payments that correspond exactly with the timing of the Earl's illness?" The room fell silent except for Lady Margaret's ragged breathing. She looked at Lillian with hatred so pure it was almost admirable in its intensity. "You." The word dripped venom. "You should have stayed invisible. You should have been grateful for the scraps we gave you. You should have honored my father's wishes." Lillian's voice was steady, carrying a strength she had not known she possessed. "You should have loved me as family rather than fearing me as competition, but you chose greed and murder instead." The constables led them away in chains, Lady Margaret still shrieking denials, Lord Edmund silent with the defeated posture of a man who knew his life was finished. Lillian watched their departure and felt nothing but a strange, hollow relief. When the house finally quieted, Oscar found her in the library, the room where this had all begun. She stood before the window where she had first seen him in the gardens, where everything had changed. "You are home." He spoke softly from the doorway. "Truly home now. This house, this estate, this life, it is all yours." Lillian turned to face him, this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had believed her when she could not believe herself. "I could not have done this without you." "You underestimate yourself." Oscar crossed to her, his hands finding her waist with familiar tenderness. "You stood before the elite and spoke truth. You faced your father's murderers with courage. You trusted me when every instinct must have screamed to protect yourself, because you gave me reason to trust." She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You kept every promise. You saw me, protected me, fought for me. And I will continue to do so." His forehead pressed against hers, his breath warm against her lips. "For as long as you will allow me." The question hung unspoken between them, trembling with possibility and hope, and the terrifying vulnerability of wanting something more than safety or justice. Lillian closed the distance, her lips finding his in a kiss that tasted of tears and triumph, and the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. When they finally broke apart, Oscar's smile held a tenderness that transformed his severe features into something beautiful. "Tomorrow, we begin the legal process of fully restoring your inheritance." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with achingly gentle fingers. "But tonight, Lillian Ashford, you rest in your own home, as its rightful mistress, as the woman who refused to stay invisible." And she realized, standing in the library where her father had once taught her that truth could be found in numbers, that she was finally, completely free. The legal proceedings moved with the swift efficiency that only ducal influence could command. Magistrates descended upon Ravensmere Hall, examining evidence, taking testimony, and documenting years of systematic theft. Within 3 days, the estate was legally transferred to Lillian's name, and warrants were issued for Lady Margaret and Lord Edmund's trial. Lillian moved through these days in a state of surreal detachment, signing documents that restored her birthright, while servants who had once looked through her now curtsied with awkward deference. The transformation was too sudden, too complete, and she found herself clinging to Oscar's steady presence as the only constant in her suddenly altered world. On the evening of the 3rd day, after the final magistrate departed and the household settled into uneasy quiet, Lillian stood in the library, watching twilight paint the gardens purple and gold. This room had witnessed so many pivotal moments: her first real conversation with Oscar, the revelation of the fraud, their first kiss. It felt appropriate to return here now, when everything had changed yet again. She heard Oscar enter before she saw him, recognizing the quiet confidence of his footsteps. He closed the door softly, and when she turned, the expression on his face stole her breath. No longer the controlled duke or the focused investigator. This was simply a man looking at a woman he desired with an intensity that made her skin flush. "It is finished." His voice was low, intimate in the book-lined space. "Justice is served. Your inheritance is restored. You are safe, recognized, and free. Thanks to you." Lillian moved toward him, drawn by the magnetic pull that had existed between them from that first moment in the moonlit garden. "Everything I have now, everything I am—" "No." Oscar closed the remaining distance, his hands finding her waist. "Everything you have you earned through your own brilliance and courage. I merely provided the tools. You wielded them." His thumbs stroked along her ribcage through the silk of her dress, and Lillian felt heat pooling low in her belly. The propriety that had governed their interactions, the careful distance maintained even in private moments, felt suddenly suffocating. Oscar. His name emerged as something between a plea and a prayer. What happens now? What are we to each other when the crisis is past, and there is no danger to bind us? Something flickered in his dark eyes, vulnerability she had rarely seen him display. "Do you wish to be bound to me only by danger and necessity? You know I do not." Her hands rose to his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath expensive fabric and the warm, solid reality of him. "But I do not know what you want from me. Gratitude? Obligation? Or something more?" In answer, Oscar cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones with devastating tenderness. "I want everything." His voice dropped to a rough whisper that made her knees weaken. "I want to wake beside you every morning. I want to argue with you about mathematics over breakfast. I want to watch you transform this estate into something magnificent. I want your laughter, your tears, your brilliant mind, and your stubborn heart." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her lips. "I want you, Lillian Ashford, not because I promised your father, not because you need protection, but because somewhere between seeing you in that window and watching you speak truth to power, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with you." The confession hung between them, trembling with hope and fear, and the devastating vulnerability of hearts laid bare. Lillian's breath caught as tears spilled over to track down her cheeks. "I love you." The words felt like freedom, like flying, like finally being seen and choosing to be known. "I love you so much, it terrifies me." Oscar's smile was beautiful and broken and achingly tender. "Then be terrified with me." He kissed her with a hunger that had been building since that first touch in this very room. Lillian responded with equal fervor, her fingers threading through his hair as she pulled him closer. This was not the gentle kiss they had shared after the confrontation. This was heat and need and years of loneliness, finding solace in another soul. Oscar's hands slid down her back, pulling her flush against him as the kiss deepened. Lillian gasped at the sensation of his body against hers, at the evidence of his desire and the answering ache building within her own flesh. She had never been touched with wanting, never been held as if she were precious and necessary and utterly desirable. His lips left hers to trace along her jaw, down the column of her throat, pausing at the sensitive spot where her pulse hammered wildly. Lillian's head fell back, granting him access, her hands gripping his shoulders for balance as her legs threatened to give way. "Tell me to stop." Oscar's voice was ragged against her skin. "Tell me this is too much, too soon, and I will stop. Do not stop." The words emerged as a desperate whisper. "Please, Oscar, I do not want you to stop." He lifted his head to meet her eyes, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Desire, yes, but also reverence, tenderness, and a promise of cherishing that went beyond the physical. "Are you certain?" "This cannot be undone." "I am certain." She pulled him back to her, claiming his mouth with a boldness that surprised them both. "I have been invisible my entire life. I want to be seen. I want to be touched. I want to be yours." Oscar groaned. A sound of surrender and triumph combined and lifted her into his arms. He carried her to the deep leather sofa near the fireplace, settling her across his lap with careful reverence. His fingers found the small buttons running down her spine, working them free with practiced patience, while his lips traced patterns of heat along her collarbone. Lillian's world narrowed to sensation. The slide of fabric as her dress loosened, the warmth of Oscar's hands on her bare shoulders, the delicious friction as she shifted against him. She fumbled with his cravat, desperate for the feel of his skin against hers, and he helped her, shrugging out of his coat and waistcoat with an urgency that matched her own. When his shirt joined the growing pile of discarded clothing, Lillian pressed her palms against his chest, marveling at the lean strength of him, the warmth of his skin, the way his heart raced beneath her touch. Oscar watched her exploration with eyes gone dark with desire, his breathing uneven. "You are so beautiful." His voice was reverent as his fingers traced the edge of her chemise, so brilliant and brave and perfect. "I am not perfect." The protest was automatic. Years of being told she was wrong was unwanted. "You are perfect for me." Oscar pulled her down into another searing kiss. "And I am going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." What followed was an education in tenderness and passion combined. Oscar touched her as if she were precious, as if every gasp and sigh was a gift he intended to treasure. He whispered endearments against her skin as he explored every curve, every secret place that made her tremble and arch into his touch. Lillian discovered her own capacity for desire, for demanding as well as receiving pleasure. She learned the taste of his skin, the sounds he made when she touched him just so, the way his control shattered when she whispered his name with wanting in her voice. When they finally came together, skin against skin and hearts beating in synchrony, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Oscar moved slowly, carefully, his forehead pressed to hers as he whispered promises and praise. The initial discomfort faded into something overwhelming, a fullness, a completeness, a sense of belonging that went beyond the physical. They found their rhythm together, bodies moving in ancient harmony while their eyes remained locked. And when pleasure crested and broke over them both, Lillian felt something fundamental shift within her chest, a recognition that she would never again be the invisible girl hiding in shadows. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the sofa, the fire burning low and casting dancing shadows across their intertwined bodies. Oscar pulled a blanket over them, tucking Lillian against his chest with infinite tenderness. "I love you." He pressed the words into her hair. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." Lillian traced lazy patterns across his chest, content in a way she had never imagined possible. "Marry me, then. Make it official before God and law. Let the world know that the invisible girl captured the heart of a duke." Oscar's laughter rumbled beneath her ear, warm and wonderful. The duke would be honored to be captured by such a brilliant, courageous, magnificent woman, though I believe I was caught the moment I saw you in that window. They stayed there through the night, speaking in whispers and comfortable silences, making love again with slow reverence as moonlight replaced firelight. And when dawn painted the library windows gold, Lillian understood that she had finally come home, not to a house or an estate, but to herself, and to the man who loved her exactly as she was. The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through Victorian society that rippled far beyond Ravensmere. The Duke of Ashbourne, reclusive and powerful, choosing to marry the illegitimate daughter of an earl. A woman who had been a mere companion weeks prior, was scandal of the most delicious variety. Letters arrived daily, some offering congratulations tinged with curiosity, others containing thinly veiled warnings about the impropriety of such a match. Oscar read them with amused detachment and tossed most into the fire. Lillian found herself both fascinated and appalled by the audacity of strangers who felt entitled to judge her worthiness. "We could have a quiet wedding," Lillian suggested one morning as they reviewed yet another pile of correspondence over breakfast. Something private, without the scrutiny and judgment. Oscar set down his tea and reached across the table to capture her hand. "We could." His thumb stroked across her knuckles. "But that would suggest I am ashamed of choosing you." "And Lillian, I have never been more proud of any decision in my life." She smiled despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. "I am not afraid of gossip. I simply do not wish to subject you to— To what? He interrupted gently. To people questioning my choice? Let them question. Let them whisper and speculate and judge. At the end of every conversation, you will still be the brilliant woman I love, and I will still be the man fortunate enough to have won your heart. His certainty steadied her, as it always did. Very well. Then we face them together. The test of that resolve came with the invitation to the Pemberton Ball, the first major social event of the season, and precisely the venue where their engagement would receive public scrutiny. Lady Pemberton, who had witnessed the dramatic dinner party at Ravensmere, extended the invitation with what Lillian suspected was equal parts genuine goodwill and rabid curiosity. Lillian spent the week before the ball in a state of controlled panic. Oscar hired a modiste from London, who created a gown of midnight blue silk that transformed her from invisible companion to Duchess-in-waiting. The woman who stared back from the mirror was elegant, confident, and terrifyingly visible. The night of the ball, Oscar came to collect her dressed in formal black that emphasized his commanding presence. But it was the expression on his face when he saw her that made Lillian's breath catch. Pure, unguarded wonder. You are magnificent. He raised her hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. Every person in that ballroom will see exactly what I see, a woman of extraordinary beauty, brilliance, and courage. The Pemberton estate blazed with light and music. Carriages lined the drive, disgorging aristocrats in their finest jewels and silks. Lillian's hand trembled on Oscar's arm as they ascended the stairs, but his steady presence kept her grounded. Their arrival silenced the ballroom like a conductor's baton cutting through an orchestra. Every head turned, every conversation paused, as the Duke of Ashbourne and his scandalous fiancée were announced. Oscar led her directly to the center of the room, claiming the space with the unconscious authority of a man born to command. He held her gaze as the orchestra resumed playing and extended his hand with a slight bow. "Miss Ashford, would you do me the honor?" Lillian placed her hand in his and let him guide her into the opening waltz. As they moved across the floor, the rest of the room faded into insignificance. There was only Oscar's hand at her waist, the warmth in his eyes, and the rhythm of their bodies moving in perfect synchrony. "They are all watching," she whispered as they turned. "Let them watch." Oscar pulled her infinitesimally closer, pushing the boundaries of propriety. "Let them see that I choose you freely, proudly, and irrevocably." As the waltz concluded, Lord Pemberton approached with his wife. The Earl's expression was warm with genuine approval. "Your Grace, Miss Ashford, or should I say future Duchess, you honor my home with your presence." Lady Pemberton took Lillian's hands with surprising warmth. "My dear, you must forgive society's initial shock. They simply cannot fathom a love story as romantic as yours. A duke seeing past convention to recognize true worth. It is the stuff of novels." The kindness nearly undid Lillian's composure. "You are very gracious, my lady. I am very practical." Lady Pemberton's eyes twinkled. "My husband married me when I was a merchant's daughter. We understand that love recognizes no boundaries of birth." Other guests began to approach, some with genuine congratulations, others with barely concealed calculation. Lillian navigated the social minefield with Oscar at her side, his presence a constant reminder that she belonged here as much as anyone. But not everyone offered goodwill. Lady Harrington, a venomous gossip known for her cutting remarks, intercepted them near the refreshment table. Her smile was pure malice wrapped in silk. "How charming, Miss Ashford, that you have risen so dramatically in station. One might wonder what talents you possess to capture a duke's attention so thoroughly." The insult was clear, the implication vulgar. Lillian felt heat flood her cheeks, but before she could respond, Oscar's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Miss Ashford possesses intelligence that would humble most men in this room, Lady Harrington. She exposed financial fraud that had evaded detection for years, demonstrated mathematical abilities that surpass many university scholars, and showed courage in the face of cruelty that would have broken lesser spirits." He stepped closer to the older woman, his height and authority suddenly menacing. As for what captured my attention, it was her brilliance, her integrity, and her refusal to remain diminished by those who feared her capabilities. qualities I suspect you would struggle to recognize. Lady Harrington paled and retreated without another word. Oscar turned back to Lillian, his expression softening immediately. Forgive me. I know you can defend yourself. But I will not stand by while anyone denigrates you. I do not need you to fight all my battles. Lillian's voice carried quiet strength. But I appreciate knowing you stand ready to do so. As the evening progressed, Lillian found herself relaxing into the role she had never imagined occupying. She danced with lords and conversed with ladies, her intelligence and wit gradually winning over even skeptical observers. Oscar watched with undisguised pride, his gaze following her around the ballroom like a tether of warmth. Near midnight, he claimed her for another waltz. As they moved across the floor, he leaned close enough that his words were for her alone. I have something to ask you. His voice held a note of nervousness she had never heard before, though perhaps this is not the ideal venue. Ask me anything. Lillian's heart raced with anticipation. Oscar guided her to the terrace, where moonlight painted everything silver, and the sounds of the ball became a distant murmur. He took both her hands in his, and the vulnerability in his expression made her breath catch. Lillian Ashford, I know we have already discussed marriage, but I want to ask you properly here now before witnesses who can carry the news to every corner of England. He dropped to one knee, and Lillian heard gasps from the ballroom entrance where guests had followed them outside. The entire terrace fell silent, every eye fixed on the Duke of Ashbourne kneeling before the woman society had questioned. I am not offering you a marriage of convenience or obligation, Oscar's voice carried clearly in the hushed night. I am offering you my heart, my name, my future, and every day of my life. I am asking you to be my partner, my equal, my duchess. Not because society expects it, but because I cannot imagine my life without you. He withdrew a ring from his pocket, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the moonlight and blazed like captured stars. Will you marry me, Lillian? Will you stand beside me and show the world what it means to choose love over convention? Tears blurred Lillian's vision as she pulled him to his feet. Yes. The word emerged as both whisper and shout. Yes, Oscar. 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger and kissed her with a passion that made the watching crowd erupt in applause and excited whispers. When they finally broke apart, Lillian saw faces at the terrace entrance, some delighted, some scandalized, all captivated by the romance unfolding before them. Oscar turned to address the assembled guests, his arm secure around Lillian's waist. Lady Pemberton, would you permit me to make an announcement? The Countess stepped forward, her face glowing with delight. Please, Your Grace, though I suspect everyone has already guessed. Oscar's voice rang out with absolute certainty. Miss Lillian Ashford has done me the extraordinary honor of agreeing to become my wife. I ask you all to bear witness and to help me celebrate the woman who has transformed my life. The applause was deafening. Guests surged forward with congratulations, and Lillian found herself embraced by women who had ignored her existence weeks before. But through it all, Oscar's hand remained on hers, a constant reminder that she was no longer invisible, no longer alone, no longer afraid. As the celebration continued late into the night, Lillian understood that this was her new reality, visible, valued, and deeply loved by a man who saw her worth when the world had tried to make her disappear. And she had never felt more powerfully, completely herself. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn morning when Ravensmere Hall blazed with color. Gold and crimson leaves drifted across manicured gardens, where Lillian had once hidden in shadows. And now she stood in brilliant sunlight as the rightful mistress, preparing to become a duchess. Mrs. Brennan helped her dress in ivory silk, embroidered with delicate roses, a gown that transformed her from the invisible girl in grey to a bride radiant with joy and certainty. As the housekeeper fastened the final button, she pressed a small package into Lillian's hands. Your father left this for you, miss. He gave it to me years ago, made me promise to give it to you on your wedding day. Said you would need to know how much he loved you. Lillian's hands trembled as she unwrapped the package to reveal a leather journal filled with her father's handwriting. The first entry was dated the day of her birth. Today, I held my daughter for the first time. Lillian Rose, named for her mother, who gave her life to bring this perfect soul into the world. Society will call her illegitimate, but I call her mine. I call her brilliant. I call her worthy of everything I cannot give her in life, but will ensure she has in death. My greatest regret is not my love for her mother, but my cowardice in not claiming this extraordinary child publicly. Lillian, if you ever read this, know that you were wanted, you were loved, and you were never, ever a mistake. Tears streamed down Lillian's cheeks as she read entry after entry, her father documenting her childhood, celebrating her intelligence, expressing pride in the woman she was becoming. The final entry was written days before his death. They think I do not know what they plan, but I know and I have made provisions. Oscar will come. Oscar will protect you. Oscar will ensure you receive everything I should have given you while I lived. Be brave, my darling girl. Be brilliant. Be visible. And never let anyone make you feel less than the treasure you are. Lillian pressed the journal to her chest, crying and laughing simultaneously. Her father had loved her, had seen her, had fought for her even as he died. The knowledge healed something she had not realized was broken. When she descended the grand staircase, Oscar waited at the bottom. His expression when he saw her was everything: wonder, love, desire, and profound gratitude, all mingled together. He offered his arm with a bow that held genuine reverence. Ready to face the world as my equal? His voice was warm with emotion. Ready to build a life as your partner? She corrected with a smile that felt like freedom. The ceremony took place in the estate's chapel, filled with friends rather than obligation. Lord and Lady Pemberton sat in the front row, their presence a statement of acceptance that had encouraged other aristocrats to attend. Mrs. Fletcher from the village inn dabbed at tears. Even some of the servants who had once looked through Lillian now watched with genuine affection. As Oscar slid the ring onto her finger and spoke vows that promised partnership and passion in equal measure, Lillian felt the final chains of her past fall away. She was no longer the invisible girl. She was Lillian Ashford, soon to be Duchess of Ashbourne, and she belonged exactly where she stood. The wedding breakfast transformed Ravensmere's dining room into something magical. Laughter replaced the tension that had once made meals unbearable. Toasts celebrated not just the marriage, but Lillian's courage and Oscar's devotion. And when Oscar stood to speak, the room fell silent with anticipation. Most of you know that this marriage began with scandal. He smiled, his hand finding Lillian's. What you may not know is that it began with justice. My wife, and yes, I claim that title with more pride than any ducal rank, was systematically denied her birthright, her dignity, and her future by people who should have protected her. His voice hardened slightly. Lady Margaret and Lord Edmund will stand trial for murder and fraud. The evidence is irrefutable, the witnesses numerous. Justice, delayed though it was, will be served. Then his expression softened as he looked at Lillian. But this story is not about them. It is about a woman who refused to remain invisible, who possessed the courage to trust when trust had been betrayed, who stood before society and demanded to be seen. He raised his glass. To my Duchess, may she inspire others to step from shadow into light. The toast echoed through the room, and Lillian felt the weight of visibility settle around her shoulders, not as burden, but as responsibility. She had been given a voice, and she intended to use it. In the weeks that followed, Lillian transformed Ravensmere Hall with Oscar's full support. She established a school for girls on the estate, ensuring daughters of tenant farmers received education regardless of birth. She opened the library to scholars researching mathematics, creating a haven for intellectual pursuit. And she used her position to advocate for changes in inheritance law that would protect other illegitimate children from the fate she had narrowly escaped. One afternoon, a letter arrived from London bearing official seals. Lillian opened it with Oscar reading over her shoulder, his arms wrapped around her waist in casual intimacy that still made her heart race. The trial had concluded. Lady Margaret and Lord Edmund were convicted. Margaret sentenced to transportation, Edmund to hard labour. The estates they had stolen reverted to Lillian's control, adding significantly to her already substantial holdings. It is finished. Oscar's breath was warm against her ear. Complete justice, complete vindication. Lillian folded the letter carefully. I should feel triumphant. Instead, I simply feel free. That is triumph. He turned her in his arms, his hands framing her face with the tenderness that never failed to undo her. Freedom is the greatest victory you could claim. That evening, Lillian returned to the library where their story had truly begun. She stood before the window where she had once watched Oscar arrive and change her world. But this time, when she looked at her reflection in the glass, she saw someone entirely different. She saw a woman who owned her intelligence, who claimed her space, who loved and was loved without condition, who had taken the pain of her past and transformed it into purpose. Oscar joined her, slipping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. What are you thinking, that I am grateful? She leaned back against his solid warmth. For everything, the struggle, the fear, even the pain. It made me who I am. It led me to you. I am the grateful one. His lips brushed her temple. You taught me that life continues after loss, that hope can be reborn, that love, when it finds you, is worth every risk. Lillian turned in his embrace, her hands rising to cup his face. I love you, Oscar. Today, tomorrow, and every day we are given. And I love you, Lillian. His kiss was tender and passionate, familiar and thrilling all at once. My destiny, my duchess, my everything. Months later, as winter gave way to spring and Ravensmere bloomed with new life, Lillian discovered she carried their child. The news filled her with joy tinged with ancient fear. What if she repeated her mother's fate? What if she died bringing this precious life into the world? But Oscar held her through the fear, reminding her daily that she was strong, that she would survive, that their child would be born into a world where love mattered more than legitimacy. When their daughter arrived on a summer morning, healthy and howling with indignation at the bright world, Lillian wept with relief and overwhelming love. Oscar placed the infant in her arms with shaking hands, his face wet with tears he did not bother to hide. She looks like you. His voice was thick with emotion, brilliant and beautiful, and absolutely perfect. What shall we name her? Lillian traced her finger across the baby's soft cheek. Rose, Oscar suggested immediately, for your mother, and Catherine for mine. Two women who deserved more than they were given, honored in a daughter who will have everything. Rose Catherine. Lillian tested the name and smiled. Perfect. As she sat in the library that had witnessed so many transformations, holding her daughter while her husband looked on with unbounded love, Lillian understood that her story was not about revenge or justice, though both had played their parts. It was about refusing to remain invisible, about claiming worth when the world denied it, about trusting that love could find you even in the darkest shadows, and about building a legacy that honored the past while creating a better future. Lillian Ashford had been humiliated by her origins, but she had found a man who whispered that she was his destiny, and together they had built something that no amount of shame or scandal could diminish, a love that transformed everything it touched, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. She was no longer invisible. She never would be again. And that was the greatest triumph of all. Some journeys begin in shadow but end in light. Lillian's story reminds us that worth is not determined by birth, that love can heal the deepest wounds, and that courage often means simply refusing to disappear. If this story touched your heart, I would be honored if you would leave a like. Your support helps me continue creating stories about people who refuse to stay invisible. Subscribe so you never miss these journeys from shadow to light. And please comment below and tell me where in the world you are listening from. I love knowing this story has reached you, wherever you are. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are seen, you are worthy, and you are never invisible.